Welcome to City Point Church. I'm so glad you guys were able to make it today. We're going to continue our sermon series on Ruth. Jim Bob kicked us off last week with a little bit of an introduction, kind of talking about this story, how great a story it is, and filled with such great sorrow within at the same time. It has a really happy ending that we'll get to eventually. Introduce a lot of the characters. I'll be talking about the same set of people today. The family of Elimelech. And I'd like to just start off with a quote from Charles Spurgeon. He said, "Would to God we were all Christians who professed to be Christians, and that we lived up to what we profess. Then would the Christian shine forth, clear as the sun, fair as the moon, and what besides, why amazing as an army with banners. A consistent church is an amazing church. An honest, upright church would shake the world. The tramp of godly men is the tramp of heroes. These are the thundering legions that sweep everything before them. The men that are what they profess to be hate the semblance of a lie, whatever shape it wears, and would sooner die than do that which is dishonest, or that which would be degrading to the glory of a heaven-born race and to the dishonor of him by whose name they have been called. O Christians, you will be the world's contempt. You will be their despising and hissing unless you live for one objective." So it made me kind of ask the question, how are we going to make a change in the world today? What are we going to do to make a difference? And why isn't it already happening? And I think Spurgeon's hitting on something here. There's a lot of division and kind of bickering in our church, but also kind of a two-facedness, right? Kind of a tongue-in-cheek Christianity. I always thought it was written by DC Talk for the beginning of one of their songs, but I found out just recently that Brennan Manning said in his Ragamuffin Gospel, "The greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips, then walk out the door and deny him by their lifestyle. That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable." And I don't want to point my fingers at the church. I mean, I have that same problem, right? When we get done on Sundays, I pack up, I go home to take my Sunday afternoon nap. I leave my Jesus outfit up here and forget to wear it during the week. Right? We have Christian leaders who are teaching, I guess, what Christianese would label greasy grace, or I found out another name for it would be sloppy agape, where they are living a life of sin but preaching against another sect. I don't know how many times I've heard of pastors who fell into an adulterous relationship with the piano player and left their family, and that was just that. That's why we don't have a piano at City Point. I'm just kidding. But seriously, we don't preach about sins that we suffer from, or we feel uncomfortable with, or we feel like that might make somebody offended. But at the same time, we pick these little things to harp on because it's easy to get up on a soapbox and preach against one thing. And there's no commitment there. There's no loyalty. So as we continue this story of Ruth, I want to look at some examples of loyalty today in the first chapter. And I will be going back a little bit and covering some of what Jim Bob talked about last week, and we'll be ending at the end of chapter 1. But we'll start in Ruth 1, verses 1 through 5. We'll look at the loyalty of Elimelech, the loyalty of Orpah, and the loyalty of Ruth. So verse 1 says, "In the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. And when they reached Moab, they settled there. Then Elimelech died, and Naomi was left with the 2 sons. His 2 sons married Moabite women. One married a woman named Orpah, and the other a woman named Ruth. But about 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion died, and this left Naomi alone without her 2 sons or her husband." And that's the only part that we have about the family of Elimelech. So Elimelech, his dad, he decides to take his family out of this bad situation. There's a famine in Israel, and he's going to make a way for them in this new community. He's taking matters into his own hands, right? He's manning up. But I think it's important to recognize in this redemption narrative, like we talked about last sermon series, that God is trying to make a connection with man. And at this point, it's very much like a parent and a child. And a lot of times God has to lay down the law because Israel doesn't know how to walk after him on their own. And we see, Jim Bob mentioned this last week in Leviticus 26. "Do not make idols or set up carved images or sacred pillars or sculptured stones in your land so you may worship them. I am the Lord your God. You must keep my Sabbath days of rest and show reverence for my sanctuary. I am the Lord. If you follow my decrees and are careful to obey my commands, I will," and it goes on to say, "give you plenty of food, give you peace, better than peace, you'll be conquerors of many nations." He promises to keep his covenant. Look favorably upon the Israelites. We pick up in verse 11, "I will live among you and will not despise you. I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people." And then just to remind them of where he had brought them from, he says, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, so you would no longer be their slaves. I broke the yoke of slavery from your neck, so you can walk with your heads held high." So that seems like a pretty easy deal. Right? Let's not set up any idols. Let's not make any poles and pillars. Let's take a day off. Be sure to worship God. And then all this great stuff's going to happen. Right? All these positive reinforcements that God has given his children to get them to walk in his way. But just so they don't miss the point, he backs up that positive reinforcement with some negative reinforcement. "However, if you do not listen to me or obey all these commands, and if you break my covenant by rejecting my decrees, treating my regulations with contempt, and refusing to obey my commands, I will punish you." You don't want to be punished by God. And pretty much what God's saying is the reverse of all I just said is going to happen. There's going to be famine, right? You're going to be conquered by other nations. And he even goes on to say in verse 24, he himself, God, will be hostile toward his people. Hostile towards the Israelites. And then for 26 verses, God paints a clear picture of what that looks like. To be on God's backside. So it's clear. Of course, the Israelites are going to keep the covenant. Nope. That's the whole Old Testament is the Israelites missing it. So it's not expressly stated, but we can kind of see from the end of the book before Ruth, Judges, this is exactly what's causing the famine. Judges 21:25 says, "In those days Israel had no king. All the people did whatever seemed right in their eyes." And this was the story of the Judges, and it's where Ruth picks up. The Israelites would break their promise with God. They wouldn't hold up their end of the deal. God would remove his protection. They would fall into captivity. They would cry about it. Finally, one day they would realize, oh, we just need to worship God again and obey his commandments. And then God would bring salvation. And then Israel would forget all that happened, and they would break their end of the deal again. And it's just that cycle. So I think it's safe to say that this famine is probably a punishment. And so when Elimelech decides to go to Moab, he's deciding, I don't want to be punished. I'm going to find a loophole in this covenant of God, and I'm just going to go over here where life is a little bit easier. And I think it's important to know that he's not abandoning God. He's not running from God. I would say that Elimelech's family had a pretty strong faith. They went into a pagan community and converted one, almost two, that we know of, Moabites. But he's doing it by his power and his will, not under God's will. And so one of the things that I want you guys to realize about loyalty is loyalty doesn't get to choose. Right? Commitment doesn't get to choose. I don't tell Molly that I'm going to be loyal to her on Mondays and Wednesdays and Thursdays and then not any of the other time. That's not loyalty. If you had a refrigerator that only worked 2 hours at a time every day, you would get a new refrigerator because that one doesn't work. Loyalty isn't self-serving. But he took his family to Moab, his wife, his sons, himself, so that they wouldn't die from the famine. And what happens? His sons, he died. Right? He thought he had a plan, but it didn't work out. And this is a tough one because, this is an example of a father trying to make a way for his family. But we need to be responsible as fathers to say the decisions we make need to still be within the will of God. God did not send Elimelech to Moab. You need to go back and listen to last week's sermon if you wonder why. The Moabites were a very, very bad people. And Elimelech wasn't in like a terribly bad place, right? That his family wasn't about to die of starvation. There was a famine, but Naomi mentions in 20 and 21 when she comes back into Israel, she says, don't call me Naomi, instead call me Mara, right? Because her husband's dead and her sons are dead. For the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. I went away full. Okay? So she left with some semblance of being full. But the Lord has brought me home empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer and the Almighty has sent such tragedy upon me? So what Naomi's saying there is my life has changed. My name doesn't fit anymore because Naomi meant sweetheart. So she wants to be called Mara, which means bitter. But we can't pick and choose, right? We can't decide what our loyalty looks like. It's all or nothing when it comes to God. So all the guys are dead. We're left with a gaggle of widows. And why is Naomi returning to Moab? Well, Jim Bob mentioned it last week. In verse 6, then Naomi heard in Moab. Why is she returning to Israel? While they were in Moab, she heard that the Lord had blessed his people in Judah by giving them good crops again. So Naomi and her daughters-in-law got ready to leave Moab to return to her homeland. With her two daughters-in-law, she set out from the place where she had been living, and they took the road that would lead them back to Judah. So the famine's over. And in the story of the judges and Israelites, for the famine to be over meant that God sent salvation to the people of Israel. And it probably looked pretty cool. Go and read the book of Judges. There's some pretty cool guys. But Elimelech's family missed out on that because Elimelech thought he knew what needed to happen. They could have stayed in Israel and been part of God's plan. but they left because Elimelech thought he knew what was best, what his loyalty looked like. So these women, they're excited to go back to Naomi's people, even these two Moabites who married into the family, and they're walking along, probably talking. That's what women do when they walk. And then all of a sudden, Naomi realizes how difficult it's going to be for these two women in Israel. They're Moabite women. Watch Jim Bob's sermon. They're going to have a really tough time. And so she kind of tries to talk them out of it. In verse 8 she says, "Go back to your mother's home, and may the Lord reward you for your kindness to your husband and to me. May the Lord bless you with the security of another marriage." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they all broke down weeping. She's saying, go back to the things that you know and the family that will accept you back, and maybe you're still young enough to get married, and at least you'll be treated right with your people. But no, the women said, "We want to go with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Why should you go with me? Can I still give birth to other sons who could grow up to be your husbands? No, my daughters, return to your parents' home, for I am too old to marry again. And even if it were possible, I were to get married to 9 of their sons, then what? Would you wait for them to grow up and refuse to marry anyone else? No, of course not, my daughters. Things are far more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord himself has raised his fist against me." And again they wept together, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung tightly to Naomi. "Look," Naomi said to her, "your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. You should do the same." This is the worst example of evangelism I have ever seen in my life. But if we were going to place Orpah into the parables of Jesus, Orpah would be the rocky soil that the seed fell on. As soon as she got an out, she was done. Life was getting a little bit rough. Wasn't comfortable anymore, right? She didn't have this awesome family to live with, to make community with. And so she decided to skedaddle. She had belief. I mean, it would take belief to say, "I'm going to follow my mother-in-law back home." So it was there, but it was quick to leave. And that's another thing about loyalty. Loyalty doesn't quit. Things got hard for Orpah. I mean, I couldn't imagine losing a spouse. That would be devastating. And at that time, because of the way society was set up, it was probably just as bad to lose a father-in-law, because it was a patriarchal society. So, kind of a double whammy there. But the thing is, real decisions are rarely easy, because the greatest commitment comes from the hardest decisions. Luther put it this way: where the battle rages, there the loyalty of the soldier is proven. It's easy to talk about your loyalty when you're eating rations at the base camp, right? You're just palling around with your buddies. But when you're in the foxhole and the bullets are whizzing over your head, or your commander asks you to take the machine gun nest at the top of the hill, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where the true loyalty comes out. Matthew 5:10 says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Orpah, she didn't know it yet, was giving up life for death. This story is about to take a turn. That's not going to ruin anything. And she decided she's going back to her people, the people of Moab. The community of Moab was a community of death. They sacrificed children to their God in a pit of fire. In fact, I've read that that's probably why Orpah and Ruth were married to their husbands for 10 years, but it never mentions any kids. Right? Well, they're not going back to Israel with children. And it might be because they were going to wait until they moved back to Israel to have their kids and raise them up. Because Orpah and Ruth grew up in a home where you were always worried that the priest would come knocking at your door and take you away to feed to their idol. So Ruth's going back to that because it's familiar. And so often we see that, right? Somebody's gung-ho, they go to youth camp and they're sold out, right? Completely committed, just on fire. And they go back home and they have to go to school and be around the people they spend their life with, their community that they've set up, and it's just too difficult. And they fall back into the things that they knew. Even though those things are death and destruction, it's just easier to stay with what you know. And so Orpah's loyalty quit. And then there was two, Naomi and Ruth. And we pick up in verse 16. But Ruth replied, "Don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us." When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said nothing more. So the two of them continued on their journey. When they came to Bethlehem, the entire town was excited by their arrival. "Is it really Naomi?" the women asked. "Don't call me Naomi." That's what we read earlier. "Instead, would call me Mara, for the Almighty has made life very bitter for me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer and the Almighty has sent such a tragedy upon me?" So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by her daughter-in-law Ruth, the young Moabite woman. They arrived in Bethlehem in the late spring at the beginning of the barley harvest. So let's focus a second on what Ruth said. She makes a startling statement. And not because of the words that she said. Those are recited a lot. Probably every other wedding uses what Ruth said as the vows. But what's startling is the situation that those words came out of. Ruth doesn't have any reason to be loyal at this point, right? Naomi has told her, "Look, God is releasing His wrath on me. You just need to go back to what you know." And Ruth is moving into a situation where she's only going to be mistreated by almost everyone she meets. But Ruth is somehow able to see past all of that. And maybe it's because her husband or her father-in-law, maybe even Naomi, told her how that passage in Leviticus ended. The one where God laid down the pluses and the minuses of following His covenant. In verse 40 it says, "But if they will confess their sins and the sins of their ancestors," so this is after they've turned away and done their own thing, and God is against Israel. "But if they will confess their sins and the sins of their ancestors, their unfaithfulness and their hostility towards me, which made me hostile towards them, so that I sent them into the land of their enemies, then when their uncircumcised hearts are humbled and they pay for their sin, I will remember my covenant with Jacob and my covenant with Isaac, my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land." Loyalty sees beyond. It sees beyond what's happening right now, the situation that we're in at this moment. It might be bad. We might feel like God has a vendetta against us. And life might be miserable and just so much is going on, you just can't see out of it. But we have to rely on the fact that God's sovereign, right? He's all powerful. He knows what's going on. But then at the same time, He's good and He's kind. And He made a way. He made an out. He sent Himself to die in our place so that our sins could be forgiven. But He's got a plan for our life that's better than anything we could dream of. It's one of the most quoted pieces of Scripture, Romans 8:28, and we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to His purpose for them. He makes a way. And so as Christians, it might seem rough, but you won't go through purposeless suffering. This hopeless, bleak, my life is meaningless type of suffering, where you lose everything and you feel like everyone's against you, even God. Because our loyalty looks beyond that. When we sign up for this relationship with the Almighty Creator of the universe, we hand over the reins of our life. We commit to not giving in no matter what. And we rest in the sovereignty of this good and kind God, because He's a loyal God. And that's why we can be loyal. He doesn't choose who gets His grace and who doesn't. He doesn't quit on you when you turn your back on Him. He sees beyond where we are now to the plan that He has for us. I love Philippians. This is a real picture of loyalty. Paul is sitting in a prison writing a letter to the church in Philippi. Being in prison would be a good reason to be upset about your life, to ask some what ifs. You know, what if I'd stayed in that old town? What if I'd stayed in that relationship? What if I'd stayed at that old job? It drug me down, but I was making a lot more money there. Paul could really be asking some what ifs. But no, he says, I once thought these things were valuable, but now I consider them worthless because of what Christ has done. Yes, everything else is worthless when compared with the infinite value of knowing Christ, Jesus my Lord. For His sake, I have discarded everything else, counting it all as garbage, so that I could gain Christ. At the beginning of chapter 3, Paul lists all of his credentials. He had the top position of a pretty prestigious job in the community, and he gave it all up. And what he's saying right here is, if he had the chance, he'd do it all over again. He would do prison all over again. He would do persecution and shipwreck all over again. He'd get stranded on an island all over again. He didn't know it yet, but he's saying, I would get beheaded all over again if it meant knowing the loyalty of God. See, Paul had found a loyalty to align himself with. And his response was, I don't have enough to give. So as we close today, if you have any kind of response to this, if you kind of feel like you need to recommit to that loyalty, or if you want to feel that loyalty for the first time, there will be a couple in Jim Bob's office to pray with you. But let's close in prayer.